One of the things we have been talking about on the Harmon Smith channel is the decline of PC emulation. Nobody's emulating games. Those who try are getting cracked down on. Guys are going to prison. Guys are getting fined. Nintendo has a literal slave working for them now because he got caught modding Nintendo hardware. And there is many examples of this happening. Many reasons as to why, and more and more we're starting to see more and more people realize that Nintendo Classics, which is of course the service on Nintendo Switch Online that gives you access to all these old classic Nintendo games, is indeed a superior service than Dolphin. We saw this recently with Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, and in fact, this is the big thing that I think has really kicked off the trend in the emulation circles, because they're starting to panic, because they're starting to realize that there aren't enough people coming into the emulation community to keep it viable. There aren't enough people to make it worthwhile, to make it profitable. Anybody who's interested in Fire Emblem Path of Radiance will just go ahead and get NSO. They'll play it through the Nintendo Classic service. And this has been something I've been predicting for a long time. I've long said that Nintendo Classics is a far more viable method of playing old Nintendo games in emulation, but over the past decade, we have seen a lot of people bending over backwards, trying to do everything they possibly can to keep up the narrative that this is somehow some bad service. And with the release of Path of Radiance in particular, it seems we've reached the tipping point where people have realized that there is no value to Dolphin. There is no reason to go out and pirate Nintendo games and get a hold of them illegally. You can just get a Switch 2 and pay a subscription service and get it that way. And that's led to the kind of this last-ditch cope from the community where they're trying to make a controversy around the service, specifically the idea that you don't literally own the games, you're just paying for a subscription service. You don't see any of these people complaining about Netflix or Amazon Prime Video or any of these other streaming services that exist. Oh no, when Nintendo has their streaming service where you can play old games by paying a 1 yearly fee, that's somehow some huge epic disaster. And it comes off like a giant cope, especially when these people have no intention of buying the games to begin with, right? All this is an attempt at trying to steer people away from Nintendo Classics and steer them back onto the emulation plantation. Back to booting up Project 64 and having the developers of that bombard you with ads to donate to them, right? They have to keep you locked in to the emulation situation instead of actually, playing the games legally. But what's happening is that more and more people are realizing that Nintendo Classics is the better experience. Instead of having a bunch of different emulators that deal with a bunch of different Nintendo consoles, you have one easy to understand system with all these different games on it. People, one of the big major copes was this idea that they don't have a wide enough selection, ass face. They're adding more games all the time, and there's already more games on there than pretty much anyone has ever played. Okay, they've been adding games and consoles regularly to Nintendo Classics over the past decade, and I'm only just now going back and playing through Double Dragon, beating that. I'm only just now they only just now released Ninja Gaiden 2. I'm playing a lot of GameCube right now. Nintendo Classics is one of the best features on Nintendo Switch, and it's been this very embarrassing cope from the community for the past several years, trying to steer you away from it, trying to tell you that Steam Deck is somehow better when you can't get a hold of Nintendo games on there legally. They try to tell you the emulators are better, that PC is better, and they're just not. And I do think we're at the point now where that's becoming very, very obvious to anybody who's remotely like interested in playing old games, because obviously the Nintendo Switch version of the game is going to be better. You know, all the lies that people had when this service was first introduced. Remember when like they released like N64 games, right? And the narrative was that like, oh no, they completely screwed it up. Not true at all. And that becomes more and more apparent over time, right? Like, you know, every time they release a new NSO game, a Nintendo Classics game, it gets like all this hype, all this attention. A lot of people get fired up to play it, and more and more people have no reason to boot up an emulator. You know, back in the day, people only got into emulation to try and play obscure Japanese-only Super Nintendo games, and now, you know, when you have all of these options on Nintendo Classics, like, why would you not go for that? You know, it's just, it doesn't make any sense. Especially when you account for the fact that the eShop does exist, and plenty of these games do get re-released on the eShop and are available through that method. You know, you have, like, you know, Metroid Prime Remastered on the eShop, even though that's not on Nintendo Classics yet. You have, like, Pikmin 1 and 2. You have, like, all sorts of stuff, right? Basically, there's no shortage of games to play on Nintendo consoles that you can only find on Nintendo consoles. And the entire narrative that, like, emulation is, like, some huge, like, scene that, like, makes playing everything on PC is perfectly possible, it's not true. It never was true. It never has been true, never will be true. And, like, what you're going to see more and more is that it's going to become increasingly unviable. Like, I would say once, like, physical media is completely done away with, like, you will not have any method of, like, coping about Nintendo Switch piracy, because traditionally what people did was that, like, well, I have a cartridge and that means that I own the game. Like even though that's not true, they're selling you a license to play it and you just use it through the cartridge. Basically, what's going to happen is that everything's going to go digital, and you're not going to be able to get to the files, like, in any kind of, like, legal way. Like, if you try to download it from the internet, that's illegal. If you try distributing it, that's illegal. If you try, like, you know, doing anything other than simply just buying the game on the very easy to use Nintendo eShop, like, you're completely fucked. And that is the current state of things. You know, like, we are at the point where people like Gandalf the Gay are making these angry videos, like, oh no, don't play Fire Emblem on Nintendo Classics. You can just pirate it on Dolphin. Like, you know, more and more of these cries from these boomers are falling on deaf ears. Why would I pirate Path of Radiance when I can support the console it's on and get ready to buy the sequel? You know. And, like, you can't tell me you're some huge Fire Emblem fan when you've, like, outright made statements about how you're not going to support Fortune's Weave, how you're not going to support Fire Emblem in the future, and that you would rather support some, like, no-name indie developer knockoff on, like, your stupid, like, created Steam page. Like, nobody cares. Okay, that's the reality we're seeing when it comes to, like, emulation, is that people... The era of pretending this is, like, the definitive way to experience Nintendo games is over, right? You can't pirate Switch 2 games. It hasn't even been cracked yet. And what's more, it's not even the best way to experience old Nintendo hardware. You know, the age-old cope of, like, well, my new Nintendo hardware can't play my old games. It's completely fallen apart. It's done. It's not a thing anymore. I don't want to hear it. And that is going to be something that we see more and more of going forward. It's something that I am very anxious to see become more mainstream. I'm very excited for more people to start talking about it, because this very well may be the beginning of the end of the PC Master Race narrative. Like, one of the core aspects of it was this idea that they would be able to play Nintendo games on their platform. And as that becomes increasingly impossible, you know, not that it was already impossible, but, like, you know, as more and more legislation stops, like, piracy and modding hardware and, like, transferring things over and stuff like that, as that becomes more and more, like, as that happens more and more often, like, the entire PC ecosystem is going to collapse. It's going to fall apart, and you're already seeing a lot of PC gamers seething about it, and it's only going to get worse from here.